Sega's most popular console by far is the Genesis. This is what put them on the map. But they had a console before that was also released in the US. However, you never hear about this one. Why not? And why did this console fade into obscurity while the Genesis lived on? Well, let's take a look. What's going on, guys? It's Podrez coming at you with another video. Alright, so we're going to be talking about the Sega Master System today. So if you've seen a couple of my videos and you like what I do, hit that subscribe button right there. We're a bit less than 500 subscribers away from 10,000, so if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. If everybody watching this video hits that subscribe button, I'll literally hit it tomorrow. We also hit the 200 member mark on Discord, so if you haven't already, go to discord.podrez.net or click on the link in the description. Anyway, this will be a pretty interesting discussion. Let's get started.
The Sega Master System, with twice as much memory as any other video game. Advanced video technology like scrolling backgrounds, graphics in 64 colors, digital sounds, and light phasers.
With the success of the Nintendo Famicom in Japan, the SG-1000 was struggling to compete. While Sega's console had some initial success, the Famicom blew it out of the water. The graphical capabilities and the game lineup were way better. The SG-1000 was obsolete as soon as it came out, so as a result, Sega would make a revision. This would be an upgraded version of the SG-1000 called the Mark III. The console would be released October 1985, roughly about 2 years after the Famicom. Unlike the SG-1000, the Mark III had superior hardware to the Famicom, so already we're off to a good start, but unfortunately it would be short-lived. The hardware might have been better, but Nintendo of Japan prevented Sega from having the game lineup that it really needed. Nintendo of Japan had a third-party licensing agreement with third-party companies that prevented them from making their games on other consoles. The Famicom had an excellent lineup of games, so Sega not having access to them was detrimental. Sure, a console can be more powerful, but that means nothing if it has a weak lineup of games. So once again, Sega lost the console war in Japan, but they didn't give up. They turned their attention to the US. The SG-1000 was never released in the States, so this would be Sega's first console ever released in the region. They were hoping that they would have some more success in the US market, so they released it under the name Sega Master System. Sega tried to make this console stand out from its competition. They claimed the graphics actually look like what the box advertises, and they really pushed that this console brings the arcade experience home. This would also be something they would do with the Genesis when it first came out. So while these are all great things, you're going to need more than that if you're trying to beat Nintendo. The Master System one-upped the NES in most aspects. The games could carry more ROM space, 48 kilobytes instead of 32, which meant the games could be bigger. The amount of RAM was also far higher on the Master System, with 8 kilobytes of general purpose RAM and 16 kilobytes of video RAM. The NES only had 2 kilobytes of work RAM and 2 kilobytes of video RAM. The color palette is where the Master System really shines though. The console could support up to 32 colors on screen at a time with a palette of 64 colors. The NES, in comparison, could only support 25 colors from a palette of 54 colors. So what does this all mean? With the larger amount of ROM and RAM and the increased color palette, developers could make larger and more complex games with more detail in the graphics thanks to the amount of colors you can pick from. Another nice feature, the Master System supported RGB output, which meant your games would look way better on your TV screen. The NES only supported composite with no option for RGB. The fact that it supported composite was good for its time though, but this is still a huge point for the Master System. However, the console did not completely outclass the NES. The NES had a better screen resolution at 256 by 240 pixels rather than the Master System's 256 by 192 pixels. Also, while the Master System came with more ROM space and cartridges by default, several mappers would greatly increase the amount of memory games had access to on the NES. So as we can see, the Master System definitely outclassed the NES in terms of hardware. When you line up the two consoles together, the Master System games definitely look better. Sega definitely had an easier time developing games for this console too. The SG-1000 was very difficult to program for because of the limited color palette, lack of on-screen scrolling, and limited RAM. So for the first time, Sega was finally able to port over some of their arcade classics. Speaking of that, let's look at some games. First, let's try Outrun. It's a very basic racing game where your main gimmick is that you can pick between different paths you want to go. I'm a little mixed on this version though. It's a pretty faithful port and I love the colors here, but there's some issues. The frame rate feels very poor, and when there's hills, the movement of the road is very choppy. Keep in mind, the Master System also got Hang On, which is a similar type of game. Here, the roads are much smoother and the frame rate is much better. To be fair though, there's no hills in this one. So going back to Outrun, it's an okay game, but could have been better, especially after seeing Hang On. Alright, now let's try Shinobi. You're a ninja that can throw stars, and you can perform a super jump that allows you to reach certain platforms. You can collect weapons along the way. The vertical scrolling is really choppy for some reason, almost reminiscent of the SG-1000, but otherwise this is a great arcade port and one of my favorite Master System games. Let's check out Wonder Boy. It's a very linear platformer where you're supposed to make it to the end of the stage. You start out defenseless, but you can collect a hammer that gives you a projectile. You can also collect the skateboard upgrade, which gives you an extra hit, but you're unable to stop moving forward. This game was also released on the NES under the name Adventure Island. We can see right away that Wonder Boy is way more colorful and appealing to the eye, but there are some advantages to the NES version. The NES one has way more diverse music for each stage. The Master System one has the same annoying tune for most of the stages. Outside of the music though, Wonder Boy is a far superior game. There's a couple arcade ports that came out really well. One example would be Afterburner, which has a really nice rotation effect and is overall a great version. Here's Rampage. This one is much better than the NES version, and it features a lot of colors on screen. Unfortunately, better graphics was not enough to boost the Master System. Sega was hoping to sell at least 400,000 units by the end of 1986, but they only sold 125,000. This is far less than Nintendo, who managed to sell 1.1 million units in that same time frame. So what happened this time? Similar to Japan, Nintendo of America had an exclusivity clause with many game companies that prevented them from making games on other consoles. Some companies didn't like Nintendo's policies, but the NES was the best-selling console, so they had no choice but to comply. The only two companies making games for the Master System besides Sega was Activision and Parker Brothers. Both companies were well known for their great games on the 2600, but they didn't get the same footing after that, and these companies would eventually leave the Master System too. Having little to no third-party support really killed the Master System, because a lot of great games on the NES were third-party titles. Like I mentioned before, better hardware and graphics means absolutely nothing if you don't have a good lineup of games. Imagine if Nintendo were more lenient. Maybe we would have had games like Contra or Mega Man on the Master System, and the competition between Sega and Nintendo would have been closer. Another thing, many companies like Konami were pushing the hardware limits of the NES, and as a result, we saw some really impressive looking games. But no one was doing this on the Master System. Imagine if more companies were pushing the limits on this thing like they did with the NES. Who knows what the Master System could have done. But this is just a what-if situation. The reality was, Sega's console wasn't doing well and they needed to come up with a plan. And they did just that in 1987. Sega took notice that Nintendo was able to see success with the NES after marketing it as a toy rather than a video game console. They figured if they give the Master System to someone that knows a lot about the toy market, the console might perform better. So, in a very interesting surprise, Sega sold the US distribution rights to Tonka. So I'm not a business expert, but to me, this was a bad move. Nintendo only marketed the NES as a toy because the video game crash was going on and no one was buying game consoles. But Nintendo made video games popular again, so I don't see why Sega wanted to do this. Not only did it not make sense, but Tonka being in charge of distributing the Master System really would not end well. The company knew nothing about the video game market. I mean, why would they? If you don't know how to market your product, consumers won't know that your product exists in the first place, and therefore, you're gonna have a hard time selling. Tonka also made some weird decisions. They prevented a bunch of popular Japanese titles from being released in the US. Considering how the console was missing many great titles that the NES had, it's weird that Tonka limited the Master System's library of games even more. The company was also going through some financial issues, so they weren't willing to spend too much money on video games. Sega was not happy with Tonka, and they would end up rebuying the US distribution rights. Now under Sega again, they released the Master System 2, which was a lower cost version, hoping that consumers might buy the console at a lower price. But this failed to entice consumers, and Nintendo continued to dominate the video game market. After their last-ditch effort failed, Sega would abandon the Master System and start thinking about their next console, the Genesis. The very last Master System game released in the US was Sonic the Hedgehog in 1991. With the failure of the SG-1000, Sega learned from their mistakes by releasing a console that was technologically superior to its competition. But Nintendo's policies prevented Sega from having the third-party support that it really needed. If more third-party companies were involved, perhaps we would have gotten more excellent titles like we did on the NES, and more companies would have been willing to push the hardware limits of the Master System. But unfortunately, we never got to see that. Hey, I just wanted to thank you so much for watching this video. If you made it this far, hit that like button. If you enjoy this type of content, hit the subscribe button for more content. Both of these things really help the channel grow. If you have anything to share, feel free to leave a comment. I read every single comment on this channel, and I'm pretty good at replying back. Anyway, have a good one.